November 14th, 1944, a holding area near Aachen, Germany. The contraction hit Ilse like a mortar shell, tearing a jagged scream from her throat before she could bite down on her wool sleeve. The sound cut through the damp silence of the barn, instantly regretting it. Outside, the heavy trudge of combat boots stopped. Mud, the smell of wet straw and antiseptic, and the terrifying click of a bolt sliding home. "In there! Check the corner!" a harsh American voice barked. Ilse scrambled backward, pressing her spine against the rough wood, shielding her distended belly with trembling hands. The flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, blinding her. She saw the silhouette of a helmet, the barrel of an M1 Garand leveling at her chest. The propaganda posters flashed in her mind. Monsters, destroyers. "Don't shoot!" she shrieked, her English broken and high-pitched. "Baby, my God, the baby is coming!" The soldier froze. The rifle lowered an inch. Another figure pushed past him, not holding a weapon, but a canvas bag marked with a red cross. "Hold your fire, Kowalski," the second man said, his voice dropping an octave, surprisingly gentle. He knelt beside her, ignoring the filth of the floor. "Easy, Fräulein. Breathe." He didn't reach for a holster. He reached for a vial of morphine and a clean bandage. If stories of humanity in the darkest places resonate with you, please consider subscribing and sharing where you are reading from in the comments below. 4 weeks earlier, October 1944, the Hurtgen Forest. The forest did not look like the fairy tales Ilse Vogel had read as a child in Cologne. It looked like a graveyard of pine trees, their trunks shattered by artillery into jagged, accusing fingers pointing at the leaden sky. Ilse adjusted the strap of her heavy leather satchel, the bite of the canvas digging into her shoulder. As a Helferin, a signals auxiliary, she wasn't supposed to be this close to the dissolving front line. But the orders had been chaotic, the retreat messy. Now she was walking alongside a stalled column of Opel Blitz trucks, their engines silent for lack of fuel. "Keep moving, ladies! Don't bunch up!" a sergeant shouted, his voice hoarse from shouting over the constant, distant rumble of American thunder. Ilse stumbled on a protruding root, her hand instinctively flying to her abdomen. Under the oversized field-gray greatcoat she had scavenged from a dead supply officer, the swell of her belly was hard and demanding. 7 months. She was carrying 7 months of a life that shouldn't exist in this place of death. "Hide it," she told herself, a mantra that beat in time with her heart. "If they see, they will leave you behind." Or worse, the propaganda broadcasts had been clear. The Americans were gangsters, released from prisons to wreak havoc on the fatherland. They had no honor. They would see a pregnant woman not as a vessel of life, but as a target. She reached into her deep coat pocket, her fingers brushing against the soft, scratchy texture of wool. It was her anchor, a ball of white yarn and 2 knitting needles, with one tiny, imperfect sock dangling from them. She had started it in a bunker in September, knitting by the light of a flickering kerosene lamp. It was absurd, a white sock for a child who would be born into mud. "Vogel," a voice hissed beside her. It was Gerda, another auxiliary, older and harder. "Stop lagging. The Amis are less than 5 kilometers out. Can you hear the small arms fire?" "I hear it," Ilse whispered, pulling her coat tighter. "My boots! They don't fit right." "Nothing fits right anymore," Gerda snapped, but she slowed her pace slightly. "Just keep your head down. We make it to the Ruhr River. We'll be safe." A high-pitched whistle sliced the air, followed instantly by an earth-shattering crump. Dirt and pine needles sprayed over them. "Mortars!" The cry sent the column into a panic. Ilse didn't run. She couldn't. She threw herself into a shallow depression at the base of a fir tree, curling into a ball. She pressed the pocket with the knitting needles against her chest, feeling the sharp points through the fabric. Please, she prayed, not to God, but to the child inside. Stay quiet. Stay hidden. As the explosions walked closer, walking a line of destruction toward her, Ilse realized the trucks weren't going to move. The retreat was over. The trapping was beginning. She closed her eyes, visualizing the white sock, the only clean thing left in her world. 2 days later, hunger forced Ilse out of the earth. She had spent 48 hours huddled in the root cellar of a shattered farmhouse, listening to the war roll over her head like a thunderstorm. Now the artillery had moved east, leaving behind a silence that was almost louder than the explosions. She emerged into a gray morning. The forest floor was a ruin of splintered pine and churned mud. Her breath misted in the damp air as she stumbled toward a muddy stream, cupping her hands to drink water that tasted of iron and dirt. The cold water hit her empty stomach like a stone, but it cleared the fog in her mind enough to realize she was entirely alone. Gerda was gone. The trucks were gone. A twig snapped. The sound was sharp, deliberate, and close. Ilse froze, water dripping from her chin. Through the mist, shapes materialized. They moved differently than German soldiers. Looser, lower to the ground, their silhouettes broken by netting on their helmets. Americans. Panic, cold, and absolute seized her. The posters she had seen in Cologne flashed in her mind. Caricatures of gangsters with submachine guns, destroyers of culture, killers of women. She instinctively stepped back, her hand flying to the bulge of her stomach beneath the oversized greatcoat. If they saw she was pregnant, they would see weakness. Or worse, they would see a future enemy. "Halt!" The voice was flat, devoid of emotion. A soldier stepped out from behind a tree, leveling a rifle at her chest. He wore a drab olive jacket that looked too thin for this weather. "Hände hoch!" he barked, his German clumsy but understandable. Ilse's hands shot up, the movement pulling the heavy wool of the coat tight against her shoulders, but thankfully the fabric draped loosely over her midsection like a tent. She locked her knees to stop them from shaking. "Don't shoot," she whispered, the English words tasting foreign on her tongue. "I am alone." Two more soldiers appeared, moving with practiced caution. One kept his weapon trained on her while the first approached. Up close, he didn't look like a gangster. He looked tired. His face was smeared with grease, his eyes bloodshot. He gestured for her to turn around. She complied, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt his hands pat down her sides, searching for weapons. He checked the pockets of the greatcoat. His gloved hand brushed against the hard lump of the knitting needles and the soft ball of yarn. He paused. Ilse held her breath, terrifyingly certain he would rip the coat open, expose her secret, and end it all right there. Instead, he pulled his hand back. He didn't confiscate the wool. He spun her around and pointed a thumb back the way he had come. "Move out," he said, gesturing with his rifle barrel. "Rear guard will pick you up." He hadn't looked at her face. To him, she was just another gray shape in a gray forest, a piece of logistical debris to be processed. Ilse lowered her arms slowly, clutching the yarn inside her pocket as if it were a grenade she had to keep from exploding. She walked, her boots sinking into the mud, stepping into captivity with her secret still safe, for now. The transport truck was a green beast that smelled of raw gasoline and unwashed bodies. It was a GMC deuce and a half, a machine that seemed to have no suspension, designed only to churn through the mud of the Rhineland. Ilse was shoved into the back, squeezed between a row of dejected infantrymen and a few terrified boys from the Hitler Youth who couldn't have been older than 15. As the engine roared to life, vibrating through the metal floorboards, Ilse pressed her back against the canvas side, wrapping her arms protectively over her stomach. The greatcoat was her shield, its thick wool dampening the sharp elbows and knees of the men around her. "Hold on," she whispered silently to the life inside her. "Just hold on." The truck lurched forward, hitting a pothole with a violence that sent a shockwave up her spine. Ilse bit her tongue to stifle a gasp. Every bump felt like a direct assault on her womb. She closed her eyes, visualizing the knitting needles in her pocket, focusing on the mental image of the half-finished white sock to block out the pain. "Lean here, girl," a gruff voice murmured. It was the man next to her, an older Obergefreiter with gray stubble and hollow cheeks. He didn't look at her, staring instead at his muddy boots, but he shifted his weight, creating a small pocket of space between her and the swaying mass of prisoners. He wedged his shoulder against the wooden slat, absorbing the worst of the jostling so she wouldn't have to. Ilse nodded her thanks, too exhausted to speak. Through the open flap at the rear of the truck, she watched the road unspool behind them. An American soldier sat on the tailgate, his legs dangling casually, a Thompson submachine gun resting across his lap. He didn't look like the monsters on the posters. He looked bored. He fished a pack of cigarettes from his pocket. Lucky strikes. The red circle visible even from where Ilsa sat. He lit one, the smoke drifting back into the crowded bed of the truck. Then he did something impossible. He caught the eye of the German soldier nearest to him, a man with a bandaged head, and tossed the pack. "Take one. Pass it back," the American said, his voice carrying over the engine noise. Ilsa watched, mesmerized and confused, as the pack moved through the hands of the defeated men. They took the cigarettes with trembling fingers, nodding mutely. No rifle butts, no execution squads, just tobacco smoke mixing with the exhaust fumes. It didn't make sense. If they were the devil's propaganda claimed, why was he sharing his rations? The truck hit another crater, snapping Ilsa back to her own private war. A cramp seized her lower abdomen, sharp and hot. She gripped the older soldier's sleeve involuntarily. He glanced at her, his eyes dropping to where her hand clutched her midsection beneath the coat. A flicker of realization crossed his face, but he said nothing. He simply braced himself harder against the wood, becoming a human wall between her and the war. The convoy slowed. Through the canvas gap, the ruins of a city emerged from the gloom. Aachen. They had arrived at the cages. The tailgate dropped with a deafening clang, revealing a landscape that looked less like a prison and more like a scar on the earth. The transit camp was a vast expanse of churned field, surrounded by hastily erected rolls of concertina wire that glistened with moisture under the leaden sky. There were few structures, just an endless sea of field-gray uniforms huddled together against the biting wind. "Raus! Los!" The command was tired, lacking the vicious snap of the SS officers Ilsa used to hear on the radio. She jumped down, her boots immediately sinking ankle-deep into the sludge. It was a thick, sucking clay that seemed determined to pull her down and keep her there. The smell hit her next, a pungent cocktail of unwashed bodies, dysentery, and wet wool. It was the smell of an army that had ceased to be an army and had become merely a crowd. Ilsa navigated the processing line with her head down, clutching her coat closed. The Americans were counting, pointing, and directing traffic, but they seemed overwhelmed by the sheer volume of humanity surrendering to them. She slipped through the chaos, a ghost in a machine, her eyes scanning desperately for shelter. Most men were digging holes in the mud with their bare hands or mess tins, trying to create earth burrows to escape the wind. She couldn't do that. The damp earth would kill the baby before it even took its first breath. Near the perimeter, a structure still stood, a dilapidated farm shed with half its roof missing, likely blown off by a stray mortar weeks ago. It was crowded, packed tight with wounded men and older officers, but it offered a shield from the drizzle. Ilsa pushed her way toward it. A young soldier blocked her path, his face grimy. He looked at her, then at the way she held her stomach. Without a word, he stepped aside. The hierarchy of rank had dissolved here. Only the hierarchy of survival remained. Inside, the air was heavy and still, but dry. She found a corner near a rotting wooden beam where the straw wasn't completely soaked. She sat down heavily, her back groaning in protest. The cold from the ground seeped through her trousers instantly, seeking the warmth of her core. She needed an anchor. Her hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from the crushing weight of her reality. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the ball of white yarn. The color was startlingly bright against the gloom of the shed. Click, click, click. The rhythmic sound of the needles was faint, barely audible over the low murmur of the prisoners, but to Ilsa it was a drumbeat of order. Loop, pull, slide. Loop, pull, slide. She focused entirely on the heel of the tiny sock. This simple, repetitive motion was the only thing she could control in a world that had spiraled into madness. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, turning the camp into a swamp. But in her corner, stitch by stitch, she built a tiny wall against the despair. Hunger was a different kind of enemy. It didn't shell you or shoot at you. It simply hollowed you out from the inside, leaving a vibrating emptiness that made your hands shake and your vision blur. By the second afternoon, the gnawing in Ilsa's stomach was stronger than her fear. She stood near the wire perimeter, watching the American logistical operations. A field kitchen had been set up 50 yards away, outside the cage. The wind carried the scent of heated tinned meat and coffee, aromas that felt like hallucinations. The American soldiers moved with a casual abundance that was alien to her. They opened tin cans, ate half the contents, and discarded the rest. In Cologne, people were boiling tulip bulbs. Here, waste was a byproduct of plenty. Ilsa wrapped her arms around her belly. The baby hadn't moved in hours. That terrified her more than the hunger. She needed calories, not for herself, but to wake the child up. She drifted closer to the fence, her oversized coat dragging in the mud. A group of GIs were smoking near a jeep, laughing loudly. Ilsa flinched at the sound, her shoulders hunching. She prepared to turn back, to retreat to the safety of the shed, when one of the men separated from the group. He wasn't carrying a rifle. On his left arm, he wore a brassard with a red cross on a white background. A medic. He looked weary, rubbing the back of his neck as he walked toward the wire, perhaps seeking a moment of quiet away from the noise of the machinery. His eyes swept over the prisoners, a sea of gray faces, and stopped on her. Ilsa froze. She didn't look like a soldier anymore. She looked like a wraith. She expected him to shout, to wave her away from the perimeter. Instead, the medic paused. He reached into the large cargo pocket of his trousers. Ilsa took a half step back, her muscles tensing to run. But he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a thick, rectangular block wrapped in wax paper. "Hey," he said softly. He tossed the object over the barbed wire. It landed in the mud with a soft thud, just inches from her boots. The medic didn't wait for a thank you. He didn't smile or leer. He simply nodded once, a quick, professional acknowledgement of her existence, and turned back toward the field kitchen. Ilsa stared at the object. She glanced around furtively to ensure no other prisoners were watching, then snatched it up, wiping the mud from the wrapper. It was a D-ration bar. She retreated to the shadow of a supply crate before peeling back the paper. It wasn't the fine, creamy chocolate she remembered from before the war. It was dark, dense, and hard as a brick, designed to provide maximum calories in emergencies. She bit off a corner, the chocolate resisting her teeth. It tasted of cocoa, oat flour, and sugar, a gritty, bitter sweetness that exploded in her mouth. She closed her eyes as the sugar hit her blood. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. As she chewed slowly, savoring the grit, she felt a faint flutter deep inside her womb. A kick. The baby was awake. The monster had just fed her child. The sensation began as a slow, tightening fist low in her abdomen. It wasn't pain exactly, but a pressure so intense it stole her breath. Ilsa sat rigid in the darkness of the shed, her back pressed against the rough wood, waiting for the muscle to relax. Braxton Hicks. Her mother had told her about them, the body practicing for the main event. But here, in the freezing damp of the transit camp, every practice felt like a warning shot. "Achtung! Inspection! Everyone up!" The shout shattered the murmuring quiet of the shed. Flashlight beams cut through the gloom, dancing violently across the faces of the sleeping prisoners. Ilsa's heart hammered against her ribs. MPs, the military police. They were the giants of the camp, distinguished by their white helmet liners and the heavy wooden batons swinging at their hips. They weren't like the frontline soldiers or the weary medics. They were enforcers looking for contraband, knives, or hidden insignias. Around her, men scrambled to their feet, buttoning tunics and straightening caps with ingrained discipline. Ilsa tried to stand, but the tightening in her belly returned, harder this time. She gasped, doubling over slightly. The greatcoat hung around her like a tent. But if she had to stand at attention, the profile of her pregnancy might be impossible to hide. "Line up! Against the wall!" an MP bellowed, his voice echoing in the confined space. She forced herself up. Her legs felt like lead. She shuffled into the line between the older Obergefreiter and a young boy who was shaking uncontrollably. She pulled the coat tight, crossing her arms over her chest to create folds of fabric that might confuse the eye. The MP moved down the line. He was a large man, chewing gum with a slow, aggressive rhythm. He patted down the pockets of the man next to her, pulling out a hidden spoon and tossing it into the mud. He checked collars, boots, looking for SS tattoos or concealed blades. He stepped in front of Ilsa. The flashlight beam hit her face, blinding her. She squinted, her breath hitching as another wave of pressure squeezed her midsection. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted iron, willing herself not to grimace, not to reach for her belly. "Don't look down," she commanded herself. "Look at the light." The MP lowered the beam. He illuminated her oversized boots, the muddy hem of the coat, and then moved up to her waist. He paused. Ilse stopped breathing. This was it. He would pat her down. He would feel the hard, unmistakable curve of life. He would drag her out to the infirmary, and she would be processed, labeled, and separated. The MP looked at her face again. He saw the pale skin, the dark circles under her eyes, and the way she swayed slightly on her feet. He stopped chewing his gum for a second. His eyes flickered with something that wasn't suspicion, perhaps pity, perhaps just indifference to a non-combatant. "At ease," he grunted, waving his baton dismissively. He stepped past her to the shivering boy next in line. Ilse didn't move until the MPs had left the shed, their voices fading into the night. Only then did she slide down the wall, her legs giving way. She exhaled a long, shuddering breath. She had survived the inspection, but the tightening in her stomach wasn't stopping. It was rhythm. The practice was over. The real battle was about to begin. The camp slept the sleep of the exhausted, a collective rhythm of snoring and coughing that usually lulled Ilse into a restless doze. But tonight, there was no sleep. There was only the darkness and the ticking bomb inside her body. It happened just after midnight. A sensation like a damp pop, followed by a sudden, terrifying rush of warmth between her legs. The amniotic sac had ruptured. The fluid soaked through her trousers, through the wool of the greatcoat, and into the dirty straw beneath her. Panic, sharp and icy, flooded her chest. The warmth turned cold instantly in the freezing air of the shed. She was lying in a puddle of her own making, in a barn filled with men, in the middle of a prisoner cage. "Not here," she pleaded, tears pricking her eyes. "Please, not in the dirt." Then the pain arrived. It wasn't the practice tightening of the afternoon. This was a physical assault. It started in her lower back, a grinding pressure that wrapped around her hips and squeezed with the force of a hydraulic press. Ilse gasped, shoving her fist into her mouth to stifle the sound. Her teeth sank into her own flesh. She curled onto her side, her knees drawn up. She reached for the pocket of her coat, her fingers scrabbling desperately for the texture of the yarn. She needed the anchor. She needed to feel the soft wool to remind herself that there was a world outside of this agony. But her hands were shaking too violently to find it. Another wave hit, closer this time. It felt as though her pelvis was being pulled apart. A low moan escaped her throat, involuntary and animalistic. In the darkness nearby, someone stirred. "Rui," a sleepy voice grumbled. Ilse bit down on the sleeve of the greatcoat. The wool tasted of mud and old smoke. She squeezed her eyes shut, seeing stars burst behind her eyelids. The propaganda posters swam in her vision. American soldiers with bayonets, laughing as they torched villages. If they found her now, helpless and bleeding, surely they would finish her off. They wouldn't waste medical supplies on a pregnant enemy. The third contraction was a tidal wave. It obliterated her control. The pain was white-hot, blinding, consuming every rational thought. She couldn't hold it back. She didn't want to die in silence. "Oh!" The scream tore from her throat, jagged and piercing. It cut through the heavy air of the shed, silencing the snores, freezing the coughing. It was the sound of raw, unfiltered suffering. Outside, the heavy trudge of boots pounded against the mud. Voices shouted in English. The barn door was kicked open with a violent crash. A beam of light sliced through the darkness, blinding and aggressive. "In there! Check the corner!" a harsh American voice barked. Ilse scrambled backward, pressing her spine against the rough wood, shielding her distended belly with trembling hands. She saw the silhouette of a helmet, the barrel of an M1 Garand leveling at her chest. "Don't shoot!" she shrieked, the words ripping out of her in broken English. "Baby! My God! The baby is coming!" The soldier froze. The rifle lowered an inch. The world hung in the balance between life and death, suspended on the tip of a scream. The rifle lowered slowly, the threat receding into the shadows as the second figure knelt beside her. The beam of the flashlight shifted, no longer an interrogation lamp, but a surgical light, focused on the terrifying reality of her condition. Kowalski, get the kit. And water. Hot if you can find it, cold if you can't, the kneeling man ordered. His voice was calm, a stark contrast to the chaos inside Ilsa's body. As he leaned closer, the harsh light caught his face. Ilsa blinked through her tears. It was him, the man with the chocolate, the medic. Easy, Fräulein, he murmured. He reached for her wrist, his fingers thick and calloused, but surprisingly gentle. I am... Doctor? No. Medic. Sanitator. Ilsa tried to nod, but another contraction seized her, bowing her spine off the straw. She screamed again, a raw, guttural sound that shamed her, but she couldn't stop it. The pain was a living thing, tearing her apart. Okay, the medic whispered. He reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a small metal tube, a morphine syringe. He broke the seal with a practiced snap, pushed the needle through the heavy wool of her sleeve, and squeezed. Just a little pinprick, he said in English, though the tone conveyed the meaning. Within moments, the sharp edges of the agony began to blur. The world softened. The biting cold of the shed receded, replaced by a strange, floating warmth. Ilsa looked up at him. He wasn't looking at her with hate. He wasn't looking at her as a Nazi or a prisoner. He was looking at her with the intense, furrowed brow concentration of a craftsman trying to fix something broken. He worked quickly. He spread a clean, olive-drab towel beneath her hips, creating a tiny island of sterility in the ocean of filth. He shouted instructions to the other soldiers, who were now hovering awkwardly in the doorway, transforming them from captors into assistants. Push, he said, miming the motion. Drucken, Ilsa obeyed. She gripped the straw, her knuckles white. She looked at his hands, hands that she had been told would strangle children. Now those same hands were guiding her own child into the world. He wiped the sweat from her forehead with his own sleeve, uncaring of the grime. Almost there, he grunted. Come on, little one. One last, earth-shattering effort. Ilsa felt a release, a sudden absence of pressure that left her gasping for air. The room fell silent for a heartbeat, a silence heavier than the war itself. Then a sound. A thin, high-pitched wail pierced the gloom. It was angry and wet and undeniably alive. It's a boy, the medic said, his voice cracking with a smile he couldn't suppress. He held the slippery, squalling infant up in the flashlight beam. Look at that lungs on him, a fighter. Ilsa slumped back against the wood, tears streaming down her cheeks, not from pain, but from a relief so profound it felt like forgiveness. The enemy had not brought death. He had caught life in his hands. The adrenaline of the birth began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep chill that crept in from the gaps in the shed walls. The baby, now wiped clean of blood and fluid, was a tiny, fragile thing against the vastness of the war. He shivered violently, his skin mottling a whirring shade of blue in the harsh beam of the flashlight. He's freezing, Ilsa whispered, her voice trembling. She tried to pull the flaps of her greatcoat over him, but the wool was damp and smelled of the trench. We need to wrap him up, Doc said. He worked with efficient speed, taking the olive-drab towel he had used for the delivery and swaddling the infant tight. It was a coarse, rough fabric, stamped with U.S. Army, but it was dry. Yet it wasn't enough. The air in the barn was close to freezing. Ilsa watched her son's breath misting in the light, tiny puffs of steam that vanished too quickly. Desperation clawed at her throat. She fumbled with numb fingers into the deep pocket of her coat. She pulled out the needles and the ball of yarn. The white sock dangled from the steel points, unfinished. It was just a heel and half a foot, a pathetic, incomplete dream she had carried across a dying country. She held it out, her hands shaking. It is not done, she choked out, tears spilling over again. I could not finish it. Doc looked at the white knitting in her dirty hand. He looked at the baby. Then he smiled, a tired, crooked expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Hold on, he said. He reached into his own bag, digging past the bandages and the sulfa powder. He pulled out a pair of socks. They weren't delicate or white. They were heavy, thick, regulation wool socks, general issue, OD green. They were enormous compared to the infant, but they were thick and warm. My spares, he said, handing them to her. Little guy needs armor, Not fashion. He took one of the heavy socks and gently pulled it over the baby's swaddled feet, pulling it all the way up to his waist like a sleeping bag. He took the second one and carefully placed it over the baby's head, rolling the cuff to make a makeshift hat. The baby looked ridiculous, a tiny bundle lost in American wool, but within moments the shivering stopped. The blue tint faded from his lips. He settled into the warmth, letting out a soft, contented sigh. Ilsa looked at the scene. Her unfinished white sock lay on the straw next to the heavy green American wool. The contrast was stark, yet they served the same purpose. For years, she had been told that these men were soulless automatons, incapable of culture or care. Yet here was this stranger, giving up his own warmth for the child of an enemy. The wall in her mind, built brick by speeches and posters, crumbled into dust. "Thank you," she said, the German accent thick, but the meaning clear. "Don't mention it," Doc replied, packing his kit. "We're all just trying to keep warm, Fräulein." He sat back on his heels, lighting a cigarette, the ember glowing like a small, steady star in the darkness of the cage. Morning did not break over the camp. It oozed through the gray clouds, revealing the full extent of the desolation. The mud looked like a vast, bruised ocean under the pale light. But inside the ruined shed, the world had shifted on its axis. A low rumble approached, distinct from the grinding gears of the supply trucks. It was the smooth, urgent purr of a Dodge WC-54 ambulance. The vehicle splashed through the mire and came to a halt near the wire, its large red crosses painted on white squares standing out like beacons against the drab landscape. "Transport's here," Doc said. He had stayed nearby all night, dozing fitfully on a crate, keeping one eye on his unusual patients. He stood up, stretching his back, and offered a hand to Ilsa. She took it. The fear that had defined her existence for the last month was gone, replaced by a strange, hollow exhaustion. She stood on trembling legs, clutching the bundle in her arms. The baby was asleep, buried deep inside the cocoon of the oversized American wool socks and the coarse towel. They walked out into the morning air. The rain had stopped. Hundreds of prisoners watched them go. Hollow-eyed men standing by the wire, silent witnesses to the anomaly of a woman and child leaving the cage alive. At the back of the ambulance, the driver, a gum-chewing corporal, jumped out to open the rear doors. He looked at Ilsa, then at the bundle, and whistled low. "Well, I'll be damned. A souvenir?" "Stow it, Miller," Doc warned, though his voice lacked bite. He turned to Ilsa, adjusting the blanket around the baby's face one last time. "They're taking you to the 10th evac. Real doctors there. Clean sheets, hot water." Ilsa looked at him. She wanted to say something profound, something that could bridge the gap between their nations, between the propaganda of her youth and the reality of his kindness. But her English was too small, and the war was too big. "You saved him," she said simply. Doc shrugged, embarrassed. He reached out and lightly tapped the bundle where the baby's nose was hidden. "You keep him out of trouble, yeah? No marching, no saluting." He paused, a crooked grin appearing. "Take care of little Fritz." It was a name the Americans used for the enemy, a label for the targets they shot at. But coming from him, in the quiet of the morning, it sounded like an adoption. "I will," she promised. She climbed into the back of the ambulance. The interior smelled of antiseptic and ether, a clean, sharp smell that scoured away the scent of the mud. She sat on the stretcher, settling the baby on her lap. The doors swung shut, sealing them in. Through the small rectangular window in the rear door, Ilsa watched as the engine roared to life. She saw Doc standing in the mud, lighting another cigarette, already turning back toward the sea of prisoners, back to his job of patching up the wreckage of the war. The ambulance lurched forward, gaining speed. The figure of the medic shrank, then blurred, and finally disappeared behind a line of trees. Ilsa looked down at her son. He was warm. He was safe, and he was wearing the socks of the enemy. The war was not over. The guns still thundered in the distance towards the Rhine. But as the vehicle rattled westward, away from the wire and the hate, Ilsa knew that for her, the fighting had ended the moment she didn't shoot.